In the stillness of a late summer evening, the last thing anyone expected was a life-altering drama on a quiet suburban road. Yet sometimes, fate has a way of interweaving strangers' destinies in the most unpredictable ways. It only took a few seconds, a screech of tires, broken glass shimmering in the headlights for everything to change. In the middle of chaos, a kind-hearted man rushed to save a life, only to find himself at the mercy of ignorance and prejudice. But when darkness threatened to triumph, an unexpected ally emerged, turning what began as a tragedy into a testament of justice and humanity. Dusk had settled over the winding roads of Fairview County, a typical suburban sprawl known for its manicured lawns, immaculate white picket fences, and the sturdy oak trees that lined nearly every street. The day's heat still shimmered in the night air, the asphalt retaining a lingering warmth. Most people had already retreated indoors, seeking refuge in softly lit living rooms or bustling kitchens, all preparing to wind down in front of televisions or dinner tables. It was a time that usually promised peace and quiet. But on this particular evening, fate had a different plan. Marcus Green, a quiet 32-year-old mechanic who rented a modest studio apartment near the edge of town, had spent much of the day finishing tasks at the automotive repair shop where he worked. He specialized in older models, those with the kind of character and grit that reminded him of his late father, a man who had been his hero and best friend. With a streak of kindness that seemed embedded in his soul, Marcus always went above and beyond for his customers. He didn't mind staying after hours to ensure a job was done right. That night, however, he was simply exhausted. All he wanted was to drive home and enjoy the solitude that awaited him. Marcus maneuvered his faded navy blue Ford F-150 out of the shop's parking lot, feeling the tension in his neck from a particularly long day. The stench of oil and grease clung to his clothes. He looked forward to a hot shower, some leftover lasagna, and maybe a late-night movie. Little did he know, these small comforts would soon be overshadowed by the most significant crisis he had ever faced. Halfway home, traveling along Route 17, he saw a flash of headlights veering wildly across the center line. As if in slow motion, a red Chevrolet Malibu swerved dangerously. Marcus instinctively pressed his brake, but by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late to avoid witnessing catastrophe. The Malibu slammed into a utility pole on the side of the road, the sudden impact accompanied by a sickening crunch of metal folding in on itself. Sparks erupted from the compromised pole, illuminating the gloom. Time felt distorted. He pulled over, heart pounding. He remembered his father's words, "If you see someone in need, help first, then worry about everything else." Adrenaline surged. Fear warred with urgent responsibility. Marcus jumped out of his truck, leaving the engine running, and raced toward the wreck. Broken glass and twisted metal made every step precarious. The smell of burnt rubber and the tang of leaking gasoline filled the air. The driver's side door was crushed in. Inside, a young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, was unconscious, slumped over the steering wheel. "Hey, can you hear me?" Marcus shouted, hoping for a response. No reply. He unfastened her seatbelt, carefully, not wanting to injure her further if she had spinal trauma. Then he heard the faintest groan. She was alive, at least for now. His heart hammered. He needed to get her out. A faint flicker of flame caught his eye at the front of the engine block. Panic coursed through him. Gasoline dripped steadily on the ground. Marcus pried the door open with a strength born of desperation. He managed to squeeze into the cabin, hooking his arms under the woman's shoulders. "Please, God, let me get her out," he whispered. With one determined tug, her body came free of the wreck. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance, but mustered enough steadiness to pull her several yards away from the vehicle. No sooner had he laid her gently on the grass than the flames licked higher, threatening an explosion. Every muscle in Marcus's body trembled with the rush of adrenaline. He checked for the woman's pulse. It was weak but present. His mind spun, recalling a basic CPR class he had taken in high school. She wasn't breathing properly, short, shallow gasps. He began mouth-to-mouth and chest compressions, hoping to keep her stabilized until help arrived. Time warped. The only sounds were his ragged breathing, the frantic beating of his heart, and the crackling of fire devouring the Chevy. Marcus reached into his pocket with a free hand, fumbling for his phone. He dialed 911. 911 dispatch. What's your emergency? There's a crash on Route 17 near the intersection with Oakwood Lane. The car is on fire. One victim, female. She's unconscious. Stay on the line, sir, the operator instructed. We're sending an ambulance and the fire department. Do not hang up. While continuing compressions, Marcus relayed the necessary details. He prayed the firefighters would arrive before the flames became an inferno. He was about to speak again when his eyes caught a swirl of red and blue lights strobing across the dark. The local police had arrived quickly, but somehow an uneasy feeling crawled through him. He tried to shake it off. Help was help, right? A tall, broad-shouldered officer, whose nameplate read Williams, jumped out of the cruiser. Another, older man, obviously the senior officer, his nameplate read Reynolds, followed him. Officer Williams approached at a brisk pace. What happened? He barked, shining a flashlight directly into Marcus's eyes, momentarily blinding him. Marcus shielded his face, gasping from the physical exertion of administering CPR. She crashed. I pulled her out. She's hurt and needs. Officer Williams abruptly grabbed Marcus's arm, yanking him away from the victim. Put your hands where I can see them, he ordered. Stunned, Marcus froze. But don't argue. Do it. Officer Williams forced Marcus to the ground with a harsh shove. The sudden movement left Marcus blinking in disbelief. Was he being arrested? The older officer, Reynolds, crouched next to the unconscious woman, checking her vitals. We need an ambulance. She's critical, he called out to his partner, ignoring the situation unfolding behind him. Officer Williams pressed a knee against Marcus's back with unnecessary force. What are you doing here? He hissed. Were you trying to steal something? Carjack. Anger and outrage fought to gain control of Marcus's mind, but he knew better than to resist. He'd seen enough on the news to know how quickly these situations could escalate. Still, he managed to stammer. I was helping her. She crashed. I pulled her out of the burning car. Williams snorted, unconvinced. He patted Marcus down, searching him. Why's your shirt covered in blood? Marcus's voice shook, half in rage, half in shock. That's her blood. She's injured. Reynolds called out again. Williams, the first need help over here. She's in bad shape. But Officer Williams was too busy spinning his own narrative. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and locked them around Marcus's wrists. We'll see about that. You're coming with us. In the distance, faint sirens cut through the humid night air. More police cars arrived, along with 2 ambulances and a fire truck. The sudden commotion drew a handful of bystanders' neighbors who peered out from their windows or ventured onto their porches to see what had happened. Marcus lay on the ground, face pressed against the gravel. His wrists stung from the tight metal shackles. The roar of the approaching fire truck momentarily drowned out his pounding heart. He could see paramedics rushing to the young woman's side, kneeling around her in a flurry of measured, efficient movements. An older firefighter with a silver mustache leaped into action with his team, aiming a hose at the Chevy's front end. The engine block engulfed in flames. Within moments, water cascaded over the vehicle, steam rising in cloudy plumes. The bystanders whispered among themselves, some confused, some outraged at the sight of a man who had seemingly tried to help and was now pinned to the ground like a criminal. A petite paramedic, her name tag reading Garcia, glanced at Marcus. Concern shadowed her face. She motioned to Officer Williams. That man's covered in blood. He might be injured or in shock. I need to check him. Officer Williams shook his head with a smirk. He's not going anywhere until I get to the bottom of what happened here. Marcus couldn't breathe well, pinned as he was. Distant echoes of his father's voice rippled through his mind. Stay calm, son. Remember who you are. The memory almost brought tears to his eyes. He fought to keep steady. Minutes later, a second paramedic approached Reynolds, who was still assisting the victim until the ambulance team could move her safely. Officer, do we have any details on the driver's identity? Reynolds shook his head. She's not conscious. No ID on her that I can find easily. She might have it in her purse, but the car's on fire. He sighed. We'll have to identify her at the hospital. Let's get her to Street Mary Medical Center. The paramedic responded. Her pulse is weak. She'll need immediate attention. As they carefully lifted the victim onto a stretcher, a subdued hush fell over the crowd that had gathered. The weight of the moment settled on everyone's shoulders. The crisis was far from over, yet one man, who had risked his life to help, lay prone on the asphalt under suspicion. As the first ambulance sped away with the crash victim, Officer Williams finally allowed Marcus to sit upright. He still did not remove the cuffs. Marcus's breathing came in slow, measured gulps. He tried to gather his composure, still reeling from disbelief. Listen, he began. I'm the one who called 911. I stopped to help her. The flames. That's enough, Williams growled. We'll take you to the station to sort out your story. Officer Reynolds approached them, his expression guarded but somewhat less hostile. Williams, calm down. Let's just question him here, he suggested. We can't jump to conclusions, but Williams was unyielding. I've seen this before. Thieves come up on an accident, pretend to help, but really, they're looking to loot. Besides, he glanced pointedly at Marcus. He doesn't look like he belongs in this neighborhood. The remark sent a ripple of disgust through those within earshot, but no one spoke up immediately. The officer's implied racism was blatant, and everyone felt the thick tension. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to maintain his composure. He'd grown up hearing such comments, feeling the sting of prejudice at various junctures in his life. Each time, it felt like a punch to the gut. One of the bystanders, a young woman in her 20s wearing a Fairview High School hoodie, finally found her voice. Officer, I saw him pull her out of the car, she exclaimed, stepping forward. He saved her life. Williams glared at her. Mind your own business. We're handling this. The young woman's cheeks burned with indignation, but her fear of challenging authority caused her to retreat. A few others muttered under their breath in disagreement, but no one else spoke loud enough to effect a change. The power dynamic weighed heavily in the humid air. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat, obviously uneasy with his partner's approach. Let's just get statements from the witnesses, he told Williams, pulling him aside. Marcus couldn't hear all of the hushed exchange, but he caught words like procedure and back off. The older officer's attempt at reason, however, seemed to make little headway. Eventually, Williams shrugged off his partner and returned to Marcus, hoisting him to his feet and guiding him roughly toward the squad car. Let me at least call my boss, Marcus pleaded. Or my brother. He wriggled in the officer's grip, but to no avail. Officer Williams responded by shoving him into the back seat, ignoring the fury burning in Marcus's eyes. With the doors slammed shut, the policeman marched off to coordinate with the other responders, leaving Marcus isolated, bleeding from minor cuts on his arms, exhausted and utterly disillusioned. Across the street, partially hidden by the shadows of a large oak tree, a tall man in a dark suit had been observing the entire episode. He wore a faint scowl, as though the scene unfolding before him was a personal affront. This man, Jonathan Russell, was an attorney who had recently moved back to Fairview County to settle his late mother's estate. Russell was no stranger to injustice. He had spent the bulk of his career battling insurance companies, advocating for underprivileged clients, and going toe-to-toe with corrupt corporations. He had a reputation for being relentless in court, something that had earned him both respect and enemies in equal measure. On this night, Russell had been driving home from a grueling day of depositions when he heard the crash. He parked his car, intending to see if anyone needed help. What he witnessed instead was a flagrant display of racism and power abuse. Though exhausted, his moral compass wouldn't allow him to stand by. Making a quick decision, Russell stepped forward. "Officer," he called to Reynolds, "my name is Jonathan Russell. I'm an attorney. I saw what happened, and I'm prepared to offer my assistance if needed." Reynolds eyed him warily but offered a curt nod. "We've got everything under control." Russell shook his head. "From what I've seen, you absolutely do not." His voice grew sharper. "You've just handcuffed the Good Samaritan who pulled that woman out of the car." Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but Russell held up a hand. "I have no intention of interfering with official police work, but I am offering to represent that man who seems to be wrongly accused." There was a pause, during which Reynolds studied Russell's face, perhaps sensing something in the man's tone that indicated unwavering resolve. Reynolds sighed. "Fine. Talk to my partner then. He's the lead on this." Russell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you. I'll do that." He approached the squad car where Marcus was still sitting, pinned by the seatbelt across his chest and the handcuffs biting into his wrists. Marcus turned his head at the sound of footsteps. The attorney gave him a nod of reassurance through the window. Officer Williams noticed. "Who are you?" "Jonathan Russell," the attorney replied. "And you are?" "Officer Williams," he said with a sneer. "This is police business, counselor. Step away, unless you want to interfere." Russell reached into his jacket pocket, carefully so as not to alarm the officer, and pulled out his card. "I'm a witness and an attorney, offering to represent this man free of charge." "I have every right to be here," Williams scoffed. "We'll see about that." He barked and marched off, presumably to confer with Reynolds. Marcus exhaled in relief, though confusion still gripped him. Russell signaled him to stay calm, pressing his palm gently to indicate that everything would be handled. In that brief moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope someone had stepped in to stand by him. Perhaps all was not lost. Despite Russell's best efforts, Officer Williams insisted on bringing Marcus to the station for further questioning. Reynolds tagged along, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Meanwhile, Jonathan Russell followed them in his own car, unwavering in his resolve to defend Marcus. At the station, Marcus was led into a sterile interrogation room, an environment designed to intimidate. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow. Williams dumped Marcus's personal belongings, a wallet, keys, and phone onto the metal table. Russell stood in a corner, arms folded, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Reynolds lingered by the door, as though torn about whether to proceed or speak up. Before they could begin, a younger officer burst into the room. "We got the victim's ID, and the hospital just called," he announced, breathless. "Her name is Kelly Harding. She's in surgery. They say she wouldn't have made it if someone hadn't pulled her out of the car when they did." For a split second, the room went quiet. Even Williams appeared caught off guard. Then he cleared his throat. "Okay, so we know who she is. What's her statement?" The younger officer shook his head. "She hasn't regained consciousness. But," he hesitated, "we also have multiple witness accounts. They're all saying that this man," he nodded to Marcus, "saved her, risked his life to get her out of the car, and then tried to help until the ambulance arrived. One of the neighbors even has a cell phone video." It was as if a wave of discomfort passed across Williams's face. All the condemnation and prejudice he had spat at Marcus just moments ago threatened to boomerang back at him. He attempted to mask his unease. "Let's not jump to conclusions. The investigation is ongoing." Russell's voice sliced through the silence. "Officer, you have more than enough corroboration to release my client. If you continue to detain him without probable cause, you're violating his rights." His tone was cold, the threat implicit. Reynolds coughed, clearly uncomfortable. "The evidence does seem to support his innocence." "Maybe we should." "Not so fast," Williams interrupted. "We don't know the circumstances surrounding the crash. For all we know, he could have forced her off the road." Russell frowned. "We have at least 5 eyewitness statements and a video that all claim the same story. Marcus Green is a hero, not a criminal. If you decide to keep him locked up, I'll be filing harassment and wrongful arrest charges first thing in the morning. A tense standoff ensued. Williams glowered at Russell, then at Marcus. But reality was closing in fast. Reynolds was already removing the key for the handcuffs. The officer stepped forward, releasing Marcus's wrists. The painful weight of injustice still left a bitter taste in the air. "Fine," Williams spat. "He's free to go for now. But we're not done here. Don't leave town." Marcus massaged his raw wrists, relief flooding his system. He muttered a quiet thanks to Russell. Officer Reynolds escorted them out, apologizing under his breath. "I'm sorry about all this," he mumbled to Marcus. "I was just trying to do my job. It got out of hand." Marcus gave a weary nod. He didn't have the energy to respond with the fury swirling inside him. He was free, yes, but the bitter aftertaste of humiliation and fear lingered like a scar on his soul. In the week following the incident, life became a surreal blur for Marcus. His story exploded on social media when the video captured by a neighbor went viral. The footage showed him pulling Kelly Harding from the burning car, administering CPR, and then being forcefully restrained by Officer Williams. Outrage poured in from around the county, and eventually, from across the country. Marcus found himself at the center of an unwanted spotlight. He had reporters knocking on his door, local news stations wanting interviews, and countless strangers lauding him as a local hero. He accepted the gratitude with humility, repeatedly insisting that he'd only done what anyone should do in that situation. Despite the swell of public support, the ordeal took a heavy mental toll. Sleep eluded him, as nightmares replayed that moment when the officer pinned him to the ground, the scorching asphalt under his cheek, and cold metal biting into his wrists. He wrestled with a deep sense of injustice. Even though he had been cleared of wrongdoing, the emotional scars were real. Meanwhile, Jonathan Russell kept in touch, advising Marcus on potential legal steps. "If you want to file a complaint against the department, or even a lawsuit for racial profiling, I'll stand by you," Russell offered. "But it has to be your choice." Marcus wavered. He wasn't a confrontational man by nature. Every fiber of his being yearned for peace, for a return to normalcy. On the other hand, every time he closed his eyes, he remembered Officer Williams's hateful sneer. Part of him wanted to seek justice, not just for himself, but for others who might suffer the same fate without the benefit of a viral video to back their claims. While this internal battle raged, Kelly Harding remained in the hospital, listed in stable condition. She had suffered a fractured collarbone, several broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and a severe concussion. None of her family lived nearby. Her mother was in Florida, her father in Michigan. She remained mostly silent, not yet up to answering questions about the night that nearly claimed her life. 10 days after the accident, Marcus was closing the shop late in the evening. His mind was on a never-ending loop, juggling thoughts about the impending legal options, the swirl of media attention, and his intense desire for quiet. He had just finished locking up when his phone rang. The caller ID read, "Unknown number." He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. "Hello?" A strained female voice responded. "Is this Marcus Green?" "Yes, who's calling?" She paused, struggling to speak. "This is Kelly Harding," she whispered, her voice raspy. I want to thank you for saving my life." Marcus's heart pounded. He had seen her pictures in the media, but they had never actually spoken. Relief flooded him to hear she was okay. "Kelly, how did you get my number?" "Someone at the hospital gave it to me," she said quietly. "I insisted. I had to speak to you." Emotions swirled in Marcus's chest. "I'm just glad you're alive." She let out a trembling sigh. "I don't remember everything, but I remember the crash, the panic, and then you pulling me out. They said if you hadn't acted so fast, I would have died." Marcus tried to keep his composure. "I did what anyone would do." Kelly's voice wavered. That's not what the officers told me later. They tried to imply that you'd caused it, or something. I didn't know what to think at first, but then I saw the video. It was horrible what they did to you. Marcus swallowed hard. It happened. I'm okay now. A brief silence stretched between them. I'm being discharged soon, and I'd like to meet you, Kelly said. If that's okay, I want to shake your hand in person, and I want you to know that I'll speak up about what Officer Williams did. No one deserves that. Marcus felt a rush of gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. I'd like that. They exchanged well wishes and hung up. As he drove home, Marcus felt a flicker of hope that maybe some good could come out of this wretched ordeal. That flicker would soon be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. The public outcry intensified with each passing day. The local news stations picked up the story, condemning the blatant racial profiling. Protesters began gathering outside the Fairview Police Department, demanding accountability. Petitions circulated online, calling for disciplinary action against Officer Williams. The city council convened an emergency meeting to address community concerns. Inside the precinct, tensions ran high. Officer Reynolds faced mounting pressure from both sides. He had done little to stop his partner's actions, and though he wasn't the primary aggressor, he carried guilt for his inaction. Whispers spread that Williams had a history of aggressive behavior, especially toward people of color, but had managed to avoid significant repercussions due to lack of hard evidence. Now, thanks to the viral video and multiple witness testimonies, the evidence was undeniable. An internal affairs investigation launched into Williams's conduct. The police chief, under pressure from the mayor's office, suspended Williams without pay pending the outcome of the inquiry. This was unprecedented in Fairview County, sending shockwaves through the department. Despite all this, Williams stubbornly maintained his innocence, claiming he was simply following protocol. But with every passing day, the walls closed in. His superiors wouldn't stand behind him this time. The media had latched onto the story, painting him as the face of police misconduct in a small town unaccustomed to national scrutiny. Kelly Harding was finally well enough to receive visitors. Marcus arrived one bright afternoon, flowers in hand, accompanied by Jonathan Russell, who insisted on being present, just in case. They navigated the corridors of St. Mary Medical Center, the scent of antiseptic heavy in the air. When they reached Kelly's room, they found her propped up in bed, her arm in a sling, bandages on her forehead. Her gaze lit up the moment she spotted Marcus. He approached quietly, feeling suddenly unsure. She extended her uninjured hand, face etched with gratitude. "Hi, Marcus," she said softly. "Hi," he replied, placing the flowers on the small table by her bed. "How are you feeling?" She gave a tentative smile. "Better, thanks to you." Jonathan introduced himself, shaking Kelly's hand. "I'm Marcus's attorney and friend," he explained politely. Kelly nodded. "I'm so glad to meet you both. I was told you've been dealing with a lot of chaos because of me." Marcus shook his head. "It's not your fault. You didn't ask to crash. I'm just glad you're okay." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've been thinking about everything. I remember the sound of the impact, the jolt, and then a hazy moment before I lost consciousness. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive." "You are," Marcus agreed gently. Kelly took a breath. "I told the investigators everything, that you saved me, and that you had nothing to do with the crash. The doctors also said my blood alcohol level was 0, which rules out drunk driving. They think maybe I dozed off. I'd had a really long shift at the diner." She ran a hand through her hair, which was still somewhat disheveled from her time in the hospital. "I wish I could have told them sooner. Maybe it would have saved you from all that trouble." Marcus offered a faint smile. "I'm just relieved you're all right. Don't worry about me." She regarded him carefully. "There's something else. I've hired my own attorney, not to sue you or anything, God. No, but to file a complaint against Officer Williams. He had no right to treat you like that. If you need any statements from me, I'm more than willing to help." Tension slipped from Marcus's shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jonathan gently placed a hand on Marcus's arm. "Kelly, we might indeed need a statement from you if this goes to court. Thank you for stepping forward." Her expression hardened with resolve. "No one deserves to be cuffed for saving a life," she said, her jaw set. "I won't stay silent." They spent the next hour talking, bridging the gap between two strangers, brought together by tragedy and injustice. By the time they left, Marcus felt an unexpected sense of camaraderie, with Kelly someone who had become a living testament to his compassion, and whose testimony could now protect him in return. Meanwhile, Officer Williams stewed in bitterness. Suspended and facing a potential lawsuit, his career hung by a thread. He had convinced himself that he was the victim of a smear campaign. Late one night, he sat in his dimly lit living room, reading article after article about the incident. Online comments ranged from furious condemnation to a few supporters praising his tough stance. But the ratio was not in his favor. His phone vibrated. One of his old contacts, a man with questionable connections, offered him a way to dig up dirt on Marcus Green. Williams's mind spun with a desperate need for vindication. What if Marcus had a criminal record? Or old warrants? Williams had already scanned the police database, but found nothing. He yearned for anything that could flip the narrative. Acting on impulse, he met with this contact in a shady bar on the outskirts of town. Over cheap whiskey, they discussed options. The man promised to look into everything about Marcus's past family, schooling, employment history. "If there's anything to find, I'll find it," he assured with a grim smile. Williams left that night with renewed zeal, still clinging to the idea that the black man he had humiliated couldn't possibly be innocent of everything. He refused to believe that his prejudice had been misplaced. As he pulled out of the gravel parking lot, dust kicking up behind his wheels, a sinister plan began to form in his mind. Days bled into weeks. Marcus resumed his daily life, though always shadowed by the knowledge that a legal storm loomed. Jonathan Russell worked tirelessly on the pending lawsuit, gathering more testimonials and preparing to confront the department if necessary. Community support for Marcus intensified. A fundraiser was even started to help him cover any legal fees, but he directed those funds to local charities instead, choosing not to profit from the tragedy. During this time, Kelly Harding made a remarkable recovery. She visited the shop one afternoon, arm still in a sling, to personally thank Marcus yet again. Word spread that she might appear on a local TV morning show to share her story, her version of events, which undoubtedly implicated Officer Williams in blatant misconduct. All the while, Williams was rummaging through the shadows, feeding his obsession. Each dead end he encountered only stoked his anger. Marcus Green was squeaky clean. No arrests, no questionable affiliations, nothing. How was that possible? Then, one day, Williams received a phone call from his contact. "There's something," the man said cryptically. "He's got a brother, Manny Green, who's had some run-ins with the law in a neighboring state. Might be something there you can use." Williams's eyes gleamed. This was his chance. Maybe he could spin a narrative tying Marcus to Manny's troubles. Perhaps the public and the courts would see the entire Green family as criminals, undermining Marcus's standing as an innocent Good Samaritan. Williams didn't care if it was true or fair. All he needed was a seed of doubt. Marcus's brother, Manny Green, was 6 years older and had indeed struggled with the law in his 20s. He had been involved with a rough crowd, got into fights, even served some months for petty theft. But Manny had turned his life around years ago, cleaning up his act, getting a steady job in construction, and reconciling with Marcus. The two weren't extremely close, but they were on decent terms. One Saturday, Manny showed up unexpectedly at Marcus's doorstep, a nervous quiver in his posture. "Hey, little bro," he greeted, voice subdued. Marcus frowned. "Manny? Everything okay?" Manny cast a glance over his shoulder, as if expecting to be followed. "I don't know. Some cop's been asking questions about me. He showed up at my job site, said I might be connected to an ongoing investigation." My boss is freaking out. Marcus's stomach dropped. Officer Williams, he murmured, dread creeping into his voice. He invited Manny inside, offering him a seat. This is retaliation, Marcus explained. He's digging around for anything he can use against me. Manny rubbed his temples, frustration seeping into every syllable. But I have nothing to do with your situation. Yeah, I messed up years back, but I'm clean now. Marcus nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I believe you. He's just trying to build a smear campaign. We have to stay calm, Manny. Don't give him anything. If you're harassed, let me or Jonathan Russell know immediately. Manny managed a weak smile. Thanks, bro. I'm sorry this is happening because of me. You didn't do anything wrong. This is all on him. We'll handle it. That night, Marcus barely slept. He felt the walls of injustice closing in once more. But he was no longer alone. He had an attorney, community support, and, surprisingly, Kelly Harding in his corner. They would stand against whatever twisted scheme Williams tried to launch. The final unraveling of Officer Williams began one late afternoon. He had become a liability, and the internal affairs investigation had escalated to a formal hearing. Eager to smear Marcus, Williams presented his evidence, Manny's past record. But the hearing committee found it irrelevant to Marcus's case. Not only that, but Manny had no outstanding warrants, no recent transgressions, and nothing that tied him to the crash incident. Desperation glinted in Williams's eyes. He raised his voice, accusing his superiors of bending to public pressure. He hurled accusations of political correctness and reverse racism. The hearing committee did not take kindly to his outburst. Adding to his predicament, newly discovered body cam footage showed that he'd been verbally aggressive from the start, ignoring Marcus's repeated statements of innocence and refusal to let the paramedics treat him. By the time the hearing ended, Williams faced multiple charges: excessive use of force, conduct unbecoming an officer, and failure to follow protocol. The recommendation was termination. The final decision would come from the chief of police. But the writing was on the wall. Hard karma had arrived, and it was swift and merciless. Following the internal investigation's findings, Jonathan Russell moved forward with a civil suit against Williams and the Fairview Police Department. The media, which had sensationalized Marcus's ordeal, now turned its spotlight on the entire department's conduct. Under enormous public pressure, the department issued a formal apology to Marcus Green, acknowledging that he had been wrongfully detained. The mayor publicly commended Marcus's heroism, awarding him a Citizen's Valor Medal. On the day of the official press conference, Kelly Harding insisted on standing beside Marcus. Cameras flashed as she recounted how she would have died if not for Marcus's selfless bravery. When asked about Officer Williams, she made her stance clear. There's no place for that kind of prejudice in law enforcement or anywhere. Applause erupted from the onlookers. Officer Reynolds also approached Marcus privately, offering a personal apology. "I'm sorry I let it happen," he said, tears brimming in his eyes. "I should have done more to stop him." Marcus stared at him for a moment, recalling the helpless rage he had felt pinned to the ground. But he also saw a man weighed down by remorse. Slowly, Marcus extended his hand. "We all make mistakes," he said. "Just learn from this." The handshake felt like a small, yet significant, step toward healing. The stranger who stepped in, Jonathan Russell, had become more than just Marcus's attorney. He was now a trusted friend. Their bond, forged in the fires of injustice, evolved into an enduring partnership. Russell, always driven to help the underdog, considered this case a personal triumph in the fight against racial profiling. At a small gathering held in Russell's home, he offered a toast to Marcus for reminding us all that kindness knows no color, and to Kelly for never letting the truth remain silent. May we keep standing against injustice wherever we see it. Kelly clinked glasses with Marcus, Manny, and a handful of their supporters. The mood was light, almost joyous, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just weeks prior. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the laughter and warmth wash over him. The memories of being thrown to the ground still haunted him at times, but the solidarity of his friends, new and old, bolstered him. He glanced at Manny, who was joking with one of Russell's colleagues. Manny looked relaxed, free of that old tension. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude to see his brother at ease. Shortly after, Kelly approached Marcus. "I'm heading back to Florida to be with my mom while I fully recover," she said, "but I'll stay in touch. Thank you, again, for everything." Marcus hugged her gently. "Take care of yourself." "Always," she replied. "And you do the same." They shared a moment of silent understanding, two lives intersected by circumstance, forever changed. Eventually, the lawsuit ended in an out-of-court settlement. The Fairview Police Department pledged to review and revise its training protocols, particularly regarding racial bias. Officer Williams was officially dismissed and faced the possibility of further legal repercussions for his actions. Marcus used a portion of the settlement money to start a community outreach program, focusing on bridging the gap between the police force and the local youth through mentorship and sports initiatives. In time, the scandal lost its novelty to the larger public, replaced by new stories. But for those involved, Marcus, Kelly, Manny, Jonathan Russell, Officer Reynolds, it was not just a fleeting event. It was a life lesson on how swiftly prejudice can dismantle good deeds, and how courage, compassion, and solidarity can restore faith in justice. Marcus returned to his normal routine at the auto shop, albeit with a renewed sense of purpose. People recognized him sometimes, calling him a hero, or thanking him for being an example of hope. He usually responded with a humble nod, reminding them that I did what anyone should do. Yet, quietly, he also recognized that not everyone would have, and that truth made his stand, and the stand of those who stepped up to help him, more important than ever. Months later, long after the dust had settled, Marcus stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie for a small community event, where he was set to speak about the importance of first aid and roadside assistance training. He chuckled wryly at the memory of his simple, unremarkable life before that night. Sometimes he missed the anonymity, but he couldn't deny that the experience had awakened him to issues he had sometimes tried to ignore. He thought of Kelly, recovered and living in Florida. They stayed in touch through texts and occasional phone calls. She had become an advocate for safer driving practices, sharing her story at local schools. Manny had also turned a corner, feeling inspired to do more good. He took up volunteering at the local youth center, teaching kids basic woodworking skills. As for Jonathan Russell, he continued his legal crusade, tackling cases that exposed abuses of power. Their friendship blossomed, built on mutual respect and a shared desire to see justice serve everyone equally. Marcus exhaled and straightened his shoulders. This was his new life, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest changes come from the darkest moments. For though the scars remained, the light that filtered through the cracks revealed something precious: hope, unity, and the unbreakable spirit of ordinary people capable of extraordinary bravery. Our story shows how a single act of kindness can spark an unstoppable wave of truth and justice. Marcus stood by his principles, refusing to let hatred overshadow his courage, and he discovered that allies come in the most unexpected forms, like the determined attorney who wouldn't take no for an answer, or the very woman he rescued, who championed his innocence. Through tribulation, they all found a way to bridge differences, heal old wounds, and usher in a new chapter where honesty triumphs and compassion prevails. If you found this story moving, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps ensure more stories that shine a light on human resilience and unity reach those who need hope the most. Spread the message that one good deed has the power to uproot prejudice, and together, we can change the narrative for the better.